And I have shared my opinion that you came as slaves. You've been politically emancipated, but you've never been spiritually emancipated. You're still under a spirit of slavery.
One of the things that is rarely spoken about is the problem of Pentecostalism and white supremacy. Pentecostalism sometimes gets a pass because it has, from its beginnings in the early 20th century, been associated with humble people. Remember the Pentecostal movement, which officially, or at least from the standpoint of church history, seems to have started at the Azusa Street Revival in 1906 in Los Angeles, California, and then spread out across the United States and ultimately around the world, often was characterized by its humble beginnings. Certainly, the founder of the Pentecostal movement was William J. Seymour, a black minister, and from that Pentecostal movement at the Azusa Street Mission, people were reached, including my own Italian-American grandparents who were immigrants and who were marvelously saved and set free from the bondage of papal religion in the 1920s and 1930s, and were not alone in terms of the Italian Pentecostal movement, which came out of that like so many other Pentecostal denominations. And of course, the Pentecostal movement eventually even influenced and spread to make an impact upon the entire world. Today, Pentecostalism is considered to be a vital part of evangelicalism, for better and for worse. As a matter of fact, in its beginnings in the early to mid 20th century, the mainline evangelicals did not recognize Pentecostalism as an evangelical movement. They saw it as a sect, and many opposed it and decried it and spoke against it. But Pentecostalism has been able to triumph, although it has been some kind of triumph, I'll tell you. Pentecostalism over the years has undergone many changes, many of them not good. I am a child of the Pentecostal movement, so I can speak to some degree as somebody from inside the movement, although I'm very critical of the Pentecostal movement for theological reasons that I will not go into here. What I want to talk about, however, judging from even the beginning quote or clip from the late Pentecostal Bible teacher, I dread calling him a theologian. I have too much respect for that term. But his name was, of course, Derek Prince. Derek Prince was a very prominent Bible teacher. He died in 2003, so he's been gone for quite some time. And this clip kind of bubbled up on YouTube like so many other things. And yet I thought that it was very important to kind of start off with it and then consider a couple of other episodes that I think illustrate the particularity of white supremacy as it is expressed through the Pentecostal movement. As I said, the irony, of course, is that Pentecostal movement often has had a great appeal among people of color, generally speaking. It has had international appeal. Again, a movement that was really fathered by a black holiness minister and spread into the black community. Of course, it was very quickly segregated by white people. White people segregated the Pentecostal movement. They left. They did not want to be so close to black people, which was typical and to a great degree typical today. So we had the Assemblies of God, which was born out of the rejection of black people, essentially, in the 1920s. And other groups formed. And so while it is arguable that Pentecostalism has been the most porous in terms of the racial divide in the country, that you're more likely to find whites and blacks in Pentecostal churches than you will, let's say, in Presbyterians, certainly, even Baptists. There's much more of a consistent racist racial paradigm very clearly viewed in the mainline denominations and traditional denominations of evangelicalism. But what about Pentecostalism? Well, Pentecostalism, again, has gotten away with a lot because it has attracted many black people. It has had, the experience of bringing people together, at least in some measured sense. And because of the high profile role of the gifts and the miraculous and so forth that Pentecostalism has espoused, many times people look past what is very obvious, although many, many black Christians involved in the Pentecostal movement will tell you that, in fact, racism and white supremacy are alive and well in Pentecostalism. Now, it should be obvious from history that from its roots, Pentecostalism has suffered from racism. As I mentioned, the segregation that took place, the development of the Assemblies of God, the separate ways. But we have to keep in mind that, unlike other denominations, Pentecostalism has managed to attract many black people into its ranks, despite the fact of the racism in the parting of the ways that took place even early on in the 1920s. We've seen Pentecostalism express itself in not only in denominational churches, but we've seen it expressed itself in revivalism, in a strong emphasis on experientialism. And we know, as a matter of fact, that Pentecostalism is viewed by many scholars as itself actually being an African American expression. It is, I think, not unfair to compare it to jazz, the birth of jazz as the first, what might be called American classical music. It has elements of Western music, but it was developed right here in the United States, and it bears the strong, definitive influence of the African American interpretation of music. A whole new classical music formed that has been called jazz. It should be called, really African American classical music. And in a sense, Pentecostalism is an African American original in terms of religion, because Pentecostalism didn't come over on the boats. It didn't come over with the Puritans. It was something that would not have taken place were it not for the presence of black people. And so there's a strong argument there. And yet it has not escaped the impact of white supremacy. And that's no surprise, because white supremacy is pervasive in the culture and history of the United States. So when you look at, for instance, the clip that I'll show you a little bit more of Derek Prince, who died, as I mentioned, 2003, was born in 1915, and it was known as kind of one of the better teachers in the Pentecostal movement, who I think started to become well known in the 1970s. I somewhat remember that. I was an adolescent, and I remember Pentecostal people talking about Derek Prince, and in those days they had cassette tapes. Some of you won't know what that is, but cassette tapes, and they would have cassette tapes of these preachers and ministers. And Derek Prince was considered one of the better teachers in the Pentecostal movement. I think, to his credit, he saw how wild the charismatic movement was getting. Charismatic movement, in my opinion, sort of corrupted and ruined the Pentecostal movement. Some of you won't agree with me. I think that it introduced too much of a diminishment of Protestant doctrine and too much of an emphasis simply on gifts and the Holy Spirit. And so you had Roman Catholics and you had Protestants coming together, and there was sort of a playing down of doctrine. And I think that essentially opened the floodgates to a lot of bad teaching that then came in the 1970s, Word of Faith, and just a lot of really bad teaching. So I think the charismatic movement was a spoiler. Others won't agree with me. They'll think that it was much more of of a positive form, and certainly it did reach people, and many people became believers through the charismatic movement. I don't want to argue against that. The Lord is able to work, but I think many times the Lord, most of the time, he works despite our problems. I think from a theological critique, the charismatic movement was not a positive thing. I think it tended to rob the Pentecostal tradition of its Protestant identity and water it down. And I think we're living with the effects of that watered down kind of experientialism, very shallow, unless individual ministers really take seriously the doctrines of the faith. They many times have become compromisers. They've become even apostates. We've seen a lot of bad teaching come out of post-charismatic Pentecostal churches. So Derek Prince wasn't that way, and yet what is so significant is that he bears the marks of a white supremacist. And it comes out in his teachings. And what is so particular about the white supremacy of the Pentecostal and charismatic set is that it is often bundled with the metaphysical emphasis on the supernatural, on demons, and so forth. And so what happens with Pentecostal teachers and preachers is they, number one, they tend to scapegoat the demons for the troubles and suffering that black people in the Americas have undergone, especially black Americans, but also including, of course, black people in the Caribbean, especially the Haitians. So what there is in the Pentecostal mindset is that black people have really suffered because of demonic oppression and so forth. So I want to play the rest of the clip that I'm going to play of Derek Prince. And listen to what he says.
And my observation is that many times there's a particular satanic king over a particular racial group, taking the United States, which is made up of many different racial groups, and where I've lived now for more than 20 years, my clear impression is that different racial groups have different satanic powers over them, and in dealing with those racial groups spiritually, it becomes important to identify the power that's over them. For instance, as everybody knows, there are a lot of black Negroes in America. Now, I have no prejudice against black people. I love them. I have a black daughter. But they are the descendants of people who were taken there as slaves. And I've shared this with black Americans. You find that most black Christians can only get so far, and something seems to stop them. And I have shared my opinion that you came as slaves. You've been politically emancipated, but you've never been spiritually emancipated. You're still under a spirit of slavery. Now, Paul speaks about a spirit of slavery in Romans chapter 8 when he says, we have not received a spirit of slavery again, but the spirit of the God which makes us sons and daughters of God. And when he's talking about slavery, if you look at the context, he's talking about religious legalism. People whose religion consists of sets of rules. Do this, don't do that. My observation again is that nearly all black American churches are extremely legalistic. Hardly any of them know the real liberty of God's grace. What is the reason? The reason is that that spirit of slavery has never really been dealt with. It still has a measure of control over them. They're Christians, many of them, and some of them are very lovely Christians. But as a group, they've never been set free.
Okay, so you heard the clip from Derek Prince. I believe this sermon, I don't have the date of this sermon. I suspect he was preaching in the later 70s, 1970s, early 80s. I really don't know. It's not that important, because I would suspect that this was an abiding belief that he held. Notice that it is essentially a very charismatic, very Pentecostal orientation that he's reflecting, an emphasis on the spiritual realm, the demonic realm, which is a biblical premise. I don't oppose that. I actually don't oppose entirely Prince's basic contention, which you don't hear in this clip, which is that looking at the book of Daniel and looking at the Prince of Persia theme, and you can check that out yourself, that there is demonic impact upon the world system. I think that there's enough biblical evidence to show that Satan is called the god of this world, that Satan boasts to Jesus that he could give him all the kingdoms of the world, that, because it had all been handed to him, I assume through the fall of Adam. He assumed the primogeniture of leading the nations, so that the world system, not the world, not the planet, not the creation, but the world system lies in the wicked one. And therefore, there is something to be said for this idea of a demonic impact upon the order of men. Paul talks about, for instance, doctrines of demons. And so there's plenty of biblical data for us to draw the conclusion, very much approximate to what Derek Prince is saying, that there is demonic influence over the nations and over kingdoms. So that in itself is not a problem. The problem that I see coming forth in Derek Prince's teaching, which reveals his own white supremacist orientation. And mind you, you don't have to be a mean or angry or mean-spirited person to be a white supremacist. It's simply an assumption that has been deeply embedded into the minds of many white people, including white pastors and white Christian leaders who do not know, who know virtually nothing about the black experience, have made no effort to study black history, have very few contacts with black people, do not feel any need to reach out to black people, do not have an opportunity to interchange and share a relationship in which they will learn to how their black brothers and sisters in Christ experience this nation and this world, and what it's like, even from the standpoint of friendships, to know. So most white Christians in general, most white people, and white Christians following suit, really do not understand what black people, don't even have an understanding of black history, do not have enough black friendships. All I've got to do is look at Facebook, and I look at white people sometimes, and I look at their friends. And I see that they might have that, what Chris Rock says, that one black friend or one or two black associates. Most white people simply do not have fellowship with black people in the same way they have fellowship across ethnic lines, white ethnic lines, Irish friends, Scottish friends, whatever. So this carries over into people who are Christians and people who are Christian leaders. This was a lot of the hoopla around the Promise Keepers movement, which came at the end of the 20th century, where Coach McCartney was trying to get a bunch of men together to come and pray together. And they came into football stadiums, and black men and white men and Latinos and Asian men were hugging up and praying together. And for a split second, it looked like we were on the cusp of something new. But in fact, at the end of the day, the white guys got tired of hearing about race, and they went back home, because this is one of the aspects of white supremacy. It makes white people intolerant of any criticism of the status quo in terms of race, and it makes them impervious to hearing black people's complaints and criticisms. They don't want to hear it. They can't abide it. They will not listen to it. So this is characteristic of a white supremacist culture. It's characteristic of white Christian culture. About 20 years ago, a couple of sociologists did a book called Divided by Faith. And although the book is about 20-something years old now, more than 20-something, maybe 24 years old, it still has veracity in terms of what the culture is like. And that is, most of the white people, white Christians who were interviewed, did not believe racism was in any sense a structural issue. They thought it was just individual prejudice. And the black people, the black Christians who were polled and interviewed, they all shared the same conviction that racism does indeed have cultural implications across the board for life. You don't want to call it systemic, because that now you say systemic and they call you Marxist, but the reality is that that racism is pervasive, and if it's pervasive, it's going to affect hiring, it's going to affect school systems, it's going to affect policing, it's going to affect a lot of things. And it's basically apparent in who's friends with who. Okay, so all that to say that the Pentecostal movement, for all of its high-minded Holy Ghost talk, never was able to challenge racism. As a matter of fact, it bought into the idolatry of race, and it became one of the advocates of racism. The only difference is that Pentecostalism, as an expression of white supremacy, tends to bundle its resistance toward black people, its diminishment of black people. It bundles that in this kind of spirituality / demonology / metaphysics / Holy Ghost talk. And so when Derek Prince is talking, now mind you, he's talking to a bunch of Asian people. He's not in the West, he's in the East somewhere, and he's talking about black people the way he's talking about them. So when I listened to this, I found it outrageous. Now my wife, of course, who's African American, was certainly outraged. But I was outraged as well, because what I heard in that, a couple of things, is that, first of all, for years, white society has been exporting a negative and diminished view of black people. Now, it's mostly done through Western secular media, movies and films that always portray black people as criminals, thugs. The women are portrayed as morally loose, prostitutes, whatever. There's not a very positive press for black Americans. The way the United States portrays black Americans, they are either clowns or criminals or people of low concern, low estate. The heroes are always white, and they're really good on that in Asia. They really like white heroes, and they like to look at white people, and they love white people, and that's unfortunately also an aspect of their colonial experience as well. So black people really got this exported image that's derogatory. So here he is in Asia telling an audience of Asian Christians that black Christians are, even though they were free from slavery in 1865, they're still in the bondage of demonic slavery. And that this is the reason why, he says, they can't make any spiritual progress. And then he says, this is why their churches are so legalistic. Now, first of all, I want to point out, legalism in the church is fairly famous in the Pentecostal circles anyway, whether it's Latinos or whites. I was brought up in the Italian Pentecostal church, and I can tell you that my mother got the worst of it because she was in the earlier generation, and they were very legalistic. Legalism does not come out of the black experience. It doesn't come out of demonic bondage. It comes out of bad theology. And because Pentecostalism has always had a greater emphasis on experience and not enough on theology, biblical theology, sound doctrine, it has often had a lot of problematic, unmatched, conflicting ideas in theology, and it has tended to default to legalism. On one hand, super spiritualism. On one hand, a great emphasis on speaking in tongues and miracles. And on the other hand, a constant obsession with backsliding, and a constant fixation on do's and don'ts. So that's more of a Pentecostal thing. It's also a fundamentalist thing. So for Prince to say that black people were kind of in a legalistic setting is a reductionist and racist assumption. He's reading black people with a lens of white supremacy. This is what he does. And so he then attributes that to demonic power, which what he's doing is he's specializing, in the worst sense, he's specializing black people and saying that they're worse off than, certainly the unspoken statement here is white people. White Christians are not in their condition. White Christians are much better off. And so what he's really doing is he's using demonic idea, demonic doctrine, demonic thinking. He's using that as the scapegoat, so that white society, white supremacy, and white Christians are not held accountable for their sin. And second of all, before we move on, I want to point out that if racism, which is primarily an expression, overwhelmingly an expression of whiteness, white people looking down on black and brown people, then where is really the biggest demon here? You notice that he doesn't say anything about white people. He assumes the superiority of white people, which is white supremacy. Now, one other thing, and I don't have time to get into it, but Derek Prince was a Christian Zionist. In fact, he spent his last days living in Jerusalem, and so for him, God's chosen people was a race, when in fact, Jews are really a religion, because there's really no single Jewish race, by the way. If you think they are, you need to go back and study history, because in fact, the Jews are not a single race. There is no one original race, racial group called Jews, because from the beginning, they've been mixed. And there are Jews in Saudi Arabia, in Arabia, in Africa. There are Jews in Europe. There are Jews in Asia. And they're all Jews. And the only thing they have in common is their religion. And of course, now we have secular people who call themselves Jews, but they're atheists and agnostics, and they're allowed to be called Jews because of the Zionist idea that Jews are a people group, that Jews are a nation. When in fact, that's never been in the Bible. In the Bible, even though the Jews had a nation, it was a religious nation. It was really a religious entity. And this is why when they stopped believing, when they were disobedient, God disposed of them. Okay, so Prince was a double racist. He was a racist against black people, and he was a racist for Israel, and they could do no wrong. They would perpetually be the chosen people, and black people would be, from his vantage point, perpetually held in slavery. Notice he has no solutions. He says this is going to happen until someone comes along, and he actually says the same thing about Native Americans, but I won't get into that because they also are the greatest victims of white supremacy in North America. Black Americans being forced to be here, their labor stolen, their identities and character assassinated, rape, violence, dehumanization, diminishment, denial, everything taken from them, and still they pressed on. And guess what? What gave black Americans their greatest ability and power? It was the gospel. It was the church. And so when he says these things, he's insulting not just black people. He's not just insulting the black church. He's insulting the Lord Jesus and the work of the Holy Spirit, because it was, in fact, the great revivals of the 18th century and the 19th century, and even again with the Pentecostal movement. This fool was talking about black people being in bondage when it was the black Christian experience that gave birth to the movement that he became a part of as the Pentecostal movement. So he was a fool and he was a racist. And I know we're not supposed to speak ill of those who were saints, but he deserves to be chastened in historical terms for being a racist as he was, for being a liar and for being a fool, for speaking ill of the very fountain that gave birth to the Pentecostal movement, which he benefited from and made his ministry about. So Derek Prince was a racist. He was a white supremacist. But the spirit of condescension and judgmentalism and singling out black people is part of the white supremacist mentality in the Pentecostal movement. Now let me give you another example of this. This goes to Pat Robertson during a terrible earthquake in Haiti. Listen to what he says.
Christy, something happened a long time ago in Haiti, and people might not want to talk about it. They were under the heel of the French, Napoleon III and whatever. And they got together and swore a pact to the devil. They said, "We will serve you if you'll get us free from the French." It's a true story. And so the devil said, "Okay, it's a deal." And they kicked the French out. The Haitians revolted and got themselves free. But ever since, they have been cursed by one thing after the other, desperately poor. That island of Hispaniola is one island. Mm-hmm. It's cut down the middle. On the one side is Haiti, on the other side is the Dominican Republic. Yeah. Dominican Republic is prosperous, healthy, full of resorts, etc. Haiti is in desperate poverty. Same island. They need to have, and we need to pray for them, a great turning to God. And out of this tragedy, I'm optimistic something good may come.
Now, this is a good example, the late Pat Robertson. Now, Pat Robertson was, in my opinion, likewise a great white supremacist. He was a white supremacist. Again, this doesn't mean that he was an evil man in terms of his daily temperament. It doesn't mean that he didn't believe in Christianity. What it means is that he was saturated in a white supremacist mentality. Pat Robertson was the descendant of slaveholders. He was a man who managed his ministry like a white supremacist. And we know this because when Pat Robertson left off to run for president, I think it was 1987, 88, he had a very capable, long-standing partner in ministry by the name of Reverend Ben Kinchlow. And Ben Kinchlow was his right-hand man on the 700 Club. But when he left to run for president, he skipped over Ben Kinchlow and he passed on the 700 Club to his son. And everybody was aware of it at the time, that this was certainly reflective of a racist and racialist orientation. Because what he's really saying is not simply that this is a family business, but that he didn't want that leadership to go into the hands of a black man of God. And so again, this is another earmark of white supremacy in the Pentecostal movement. You will never see white Pentecostals in any significant numbers following black leaders. You will never see that. You may get a few exceptions. You may get a few high-profile black leaders who will attract some white leaders, but for the most part, you will never see as many white Pentecostals following a black Pentecostal leader. And this is generally true about evangelicals, but specifically, you will never see this in the Pentecostal movement, but you will see many more black people following white Pentecostal leaders. And many times to their own disadvantage, because many of these churches that have white pastors that have many, many black people, often they appear to be, socially speaking, as the late Bishop Wilbert McKinley would put it, plantations, because they have all white leaders and many, many black and Latino followers. This is certainly true in New York City in some churches I've seen. And so, again, I want to stress that, that dynamic is there. So the dynamic of condescension, the dynamic of viewing black people as spiritually inferior, and the Pat Robertson clip what he's doing is he's once again bundling the guilt of white supremacy, of which he is a part of as an heir to slavery and as an active proponent of white supremacist thinking. He bundles that in this pseudo-spiritual argument to say that the Haitian Revolution succeeded because all these Haitians got together and made a pact with the devil. Now, I want to tell you, that's some BS. The Haitian Revolution was a marvelous, brilliant expression of human rights and the struggle for justice. And the reality is that the Haitian Revolution was successful because of great leadership, because of brave men and women, particularly Toussaint Louverture, who was the leader, and then those who followed, who were able to overthrow the French colonizer. But it also had to do somewhat to the providences of God, that the French got sick in Haiti. And meanwhile, over in Europe, Napoleon had bigger fish to fry, and so he sort of gave up on trying to conquer Haiti. And so the Haitians were able to triumph. And furthermore, and this is what knuckleheads like Pat Robertson, and I have to say it, I'm sorry, he was a knucklehead. He was a racist, slave-holding seed of a knucklehead. Because for him to say that about the Haitian Revolution, he shows his ignorance of history. Does he not realize that because the Haitian Revolution succeeded, France, Napoleon could not carry on war on two continents. And so he ceded the Louisiana Territory to the young United States. In a very real way, Haiti prevented the French from coming into North America. Haiti actually secured the United States. And because of Haiti's triumph, Jefferson was able to buy all the territory, the Northwest Territory, because Napoleon just could not manage two wars. And of course, we know he was defeated and so forth. So, in fact, the Haitian Revolution was a godsend. If you believe that this country, I'm not saying that I do, but I'm saying if you're one of these people that believes in the mythology that of a special America and a special, exceptional America, then you really should view the Haitian Revolution as something to the advantage. You should see it as an act of God, not as an act of the devil, not as a victory acquired. But this is the mentality of slaveholders and their children. Now, whatever else you might say about Pat Robertson, he fed the poor and he helped people. I'm sure he did. Again, God is his judge. But I'm entitled to my opinion of him, and I watched him for many years. I'm not young. I watched him. I remember him from the early 1970s. And as I became more aware of the dynamics of white supremacy, I realized that Pat Robertson was a manifest son of the slaveholders and a white supremacist, and yet he was a Pentecostal. So once again, he blames the Haitian Revolution as if it's a bad thing. They won because the devil enabled them to do it. Because what he's really telling you is that the Haitian Revolution should not have succeeded. And then he says that they've suffered so much. But the reality is that Haiti has suffered because of American foreign policy. Yeah, I know they've had some earthquakes, but earthquakes happen all over the place. But the fact is that if they have the support that Israel receives from the United States, then those earthquakes and those other problems that Haitians have faced would not have been as destructive. But the fact of the matter is that Haiti has been cursed not by God, not even by the devil, but by the State Department of the United States. And Uncle Sam treats the Haitian people with contempt, and it spills over even in Donald Trump's, the newly reelected president, when he was talking all that nonsense some months back about Haitians eating cats and dogs. All this fits into the psyche of white supremacy. And Pat Robertson was saying those things long before Donald Trump was a factor. because he was a slaveholder's seed and a slaveholder's, advocate and a white supremacist. And all white supremacists want is the support, whether they are white supremacists in the Republican Party, white supremacists in the Democratic Party. They've shown that all they want is black people to support them, to vote, and give them money. And the white Pentecostal churches are the same way. They will give all their money to Israel. They will do everything for Israel. They'll do everything for themselves. And yes, they'll send missionaries to Africa. But when it comes to black Americans who live across town, they've got nothing good to say for them. They're ready to judge them. They attribute anything bad to demons, to demonology. They blame them, and when they can't blame them sociologically and politically, they blame their bondage to Satan. And so it's a white supremacist Pentecostal movement. Now, I'm going to show you one last, and this is the most recent. This probably speaks for itself.
Now, I'm fixing to make some people mad right now. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to be, for the statement I'm about to make, I'm going to be called a racist. And I will be called every name under the sun. But somebody needs to stand up and speak to the black church. When the largest African American Pentecostal denomination, when that leader stands up and said, I endorse that woman, he was saying, I endorse murder. I endorse homosexuality. I endorse lesbianism. I endorse transgenderism. I endorse every evil that hell could prosper or bring up to the right. That's wrong, folks. And the black church votes predominantly for the party that is anti-God. What's going on here? What's going on? See, my statement to them is this. We've had them call into the program, I don't like it when you talk about like that. Well, no, the problem is they don't like it because we're stepping on their toes. Hello? They're cowards. You see, listen. Whenever you take a stand like I'm taking, there will be some people leave the church. There will some people get mad and walk out. But understand this, I don't work for you. I don't work for you. I work for the Lord. I'm a Christian.
So now we have this, and this is the last vignette. This is Donnie Swaggart. Now again, if you watch the Jimmy Swaggart show, I think you'd find that the father was probably more benign. I think even a lot of African American Christians kind of like Jimmy Swaggart. He's a great musical, gifted musically and inspirational as a preacher. Not my cup of tea, but a godly man who emphasized the cross. And yet the paradigm of the Jimmy Swaggart ministry is very much in line with most of the so-called Bible Belt Pentecostal churches, which again assumes black people will follow but never lead, assumes that the policies of the church are determined by white supremacist priorities. Never are they concerned about the concerns of black people. So if you are a politically critical thinker and you're a black Christian and you're a Pentecostal, you really are not going to be in a white Pentecostal church. And especially when you're dealing with these Southern boys. Because now again, Swaggart is more benign. But you can see in his son, Donnie Swaggart's outburst, his anger. Now, first of all, I think that this guy has an anger problem anyway, because he always seems to have a bitter edge to himself. He's not very charming in his presentation, and he needs some help. I think his son is probably going to be a better heir to that throne. But But here you see how Donnie Swaggart unleashes this tirade against the black church, and he precedes it by saying, well, I know I'm going to get criticized. Of course you're going to get criticized, fool. You essentially got up on your high racist horse and you made a judgment upon an entire body of believers as if all of them, and then you disrespected Kamala Harris. He didn't refer to her by name. He didn't show her respect. And again, this is the way of Bible Belt Christianity. I remember seeing the late Jerry Falwell, who was another racialist, a Christian Zionist who gave everything to Israel but had no great respect or regard or interest in black people and their struggles. And I remember seeing him on TV with the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Reverend Jackson was calling him Reverend Falwell, and he was calling Jesse Jackson Jesse. Real down-home stuff, real massa in the big house stuff. And so this is the way these people think. And you've got to understand that with televangelism, it is the Bible Belt religion, which is really just another way of talking about the slaveholders' religion. It is the Bible Belt religion that became definitive in fundamentalist and Pentecostal religion across the board. So even though you might have Pentecostal preachers up north, they are, as Malcolm X said, everything below the Canadian border is the South. Well, that's even probably just as true about the Pentecostal movement. It is essentially, even if it's in the North, it is essentially a Southern good old boy religion, whether or not the pastor is from the South or not, because the values that are embedded, the social values, the cultural values that are embedded in Pentecostalism are racist to the core. And they don't have to be virulent and hateful. They are simply that we will determine what the political and social priorities are, as Donnie Swaggart does. He said, you got to vote the Republican Party, because if you don't, how can you call yourself a Christian? And this is what a lot of these Trumpite Christians were saying to black believers. As if there are not other dynamics, as if there is no history of white supremacy, as if black people don't have their own eyes and ears to evaluate not only the past, but the present. And yes, we can argue about candidates and problems, but the whole political system is corrupt anyway, and we all generally would agree with that. But somehow, white supremacy sanctifies itself in the Pentecostal movement and in the evangelical movement of which it is a part, and determines that it will say what candidates and what parties can be voted for, while black people are to be condemned. So notice that in Pentecostalism, you get this range of white supremacist condescension, starting with saying that black people are suffering not because of white supremacy, not because of inequity, not because of injustice. They're suffering because of demon slavery. They're suffering because of a pact with the devil. They're suffering because they're in rebellion against God, and they're voting for the candidates from hell while they should be voting for the Republican Party and making all the right decisions, as if they were pro-life. And I don't need to say it, it's been said a million times over. These Republicans and people like Donnie Swaggart, who are Christians, who say they believe in pro-life, but are they concerned about racial justice? Were they upset to see police on camera beating black men, shooting black men? Has that ever been an issue? Have you ever heard a white Pentecostal preacher protesting against racial injustice in policing, in economics, in housing? Is there any real concern on the part of white Pentecostal preachers for young black men? The Pentecostal movement is a deeply racist movement. It may not look like the racism of the old Baptists and the Methodists and the others, but it is in fact the heir to white Christian racism. It is the epitome of white supremacy and Christianity, because it has the audacity to appropriate the spiritual to contort it and twist it into condemnation and judgment upon black people, indeed black Christians, and then to elevate itself as if it is in a position to make judgments when it is in fact a movement that is riddled with contradictions, hypocrisies, and sins. And that's just the way it is.